You're welcome back to this week's podcast. And this week, I am so delighted to let you know that I'm joined by Kerry Murphy, an early childhood education specialist. And Kerry's here on the podcast to chat to us all about how to be neuroaffirming in the early years. Well, I would say actually generally across all of society, across all of ages, because after reading your incredible book, I was so interested to talk to you about your perspectives. And I know here in Ireland, all of our incredible early years educators are always trying to be neuroaffirming. And it's great to now have your fabulous website, also your neuroaffirming practices in early childhood. I would just call it like a manual for life. Like everything that you're talking about, it is applicable. Like I have children that are, my youngest now is 8, my eldest is 18. All of this information really can be supportive of all age groups into adulthood. So it's really just being neuroaffirmative in your practice. Broadly, I would say it's useful to everybody, including for say educators listening, SNAs listening, lecturers listening. Like there's so much incredible information to get from the book, but also from your website. So for anyone listening, I suppose, Kerry, do you want to let them know a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing to say is thank you for such a lovely commentary on the work that I'm doing in early years. It's really affirming and reassuring that it's resonating with people. And I think that point around neurodiversity-affirming practices from the cradle to the grave, it's something that we want to do across people's lived experiences and lifespan, and to give everybody a good quality of life. So yeah, thank you for that. And a little bit about me. So I'm Kerry. I am an early childhood, I always air quote specialist. I'm just very, very passionate about early childhood and diverse development. I'm really interested in those first few years of life. And so the work that I've done over the years, the very first experience I had when I worked in a nursery was with a child with developmental differences. And I just gravitated towards those children that didn't, conventionally fit in. And so across my career, I've always been passionate and specialised in supporting those children with developmental differences. And because I work in the early years, it's always been around those traits and experiences and characteristics as they emerge, as we come to understand and development unfolds. And so I very intentionally stayed in that developmental phase because I really liked that process. And so over the years, I've worked with babies, toddlers, preschoolers. I've worked in school environments, local authorities, and in the last decade, I moved into higher education as a lecturer, because I decided to start my doctorate, which will hopefully be finished soon. It's driving me to distraction, but it will hopefully be finished this time next year. And obviously also neurodivergent identifying. I am autistic and ADHD and also MAD identifying. So I experience altered states, or what we might refer to as mental illness. And I'm often open with people about that. I recognize the privilege I have to be open about that, but also I think particularly being a woman in education, we're always expected to be calm and compliant and regulated and neat and maternal. And actually, I think that recognizing our differences and recognizing some of our adversities within those differences, they contribute to the role that I do rather than pose a risk. And so I really think that we need space to be able to show up as who we are, and the whole of who we are. So yeah, that's me.
And also just thanks for sharing your identity with me as well. Like it is a privilege when people feel safe that they can just be themselves. So thank you for, I suppose, allowing me into your safe space to chat to you today. I suppose I'm thinking about really just broadly about the book now. And there was lots of different, if anyone's watching the video format, I've been kind of annotating and highlighting throughout the book. But I suppose there was different key phrases that you use. Like, for example, one of them, which I love, and I definitely will be crediting you when I say this in the future, when I'm talking to people in the early years, is planting seeds for neurodiversity. You also talk a lot about breaking down ableism. You talk about, beliefs, attitudes. You talk about partnering with families, with parents, with carers. There's so much in this book for every, as you say, it's from the cradle to the grave, but say focusing now just on the early years. If I'm an early years practitioner and I'm now maybe more aware that maybe my practice unintentionally hasn't been as neuroaffirmative as it could be, where could I start now? What's the first step, or what do you think, where's a good place to start in trying to understand how can I be neuroaffirmative as an educator?
So you've got a bit of I suppose, of a paradox in early childhood at the minute. I often argue the point that early childhood, particularly education, is one of the most naturally neurodiversity affirming spaces, because what we tend to be afforded in early education, because we're not compulsory, is that we can be child-led, we can be child-centered, we can embrace the self-directed play of children, we can follow children's interests, we can enable children's development to unfold down different developmental pathways. We often talk about this concept of a unique child, and that children develop at their own rate and their own pace. So I would say on paper, and what I often see in practice, is that we are the most naturally neurodiversity affirming space. But I think that we also are encountering some really intense challenges. So we, as a developmental phase, are under a lot of pressure for school readiness. And that often imposes itself on our capacity to be able to engage in those things that do feel natural to us. So we suddenly feel that pressure to kind of be getting children ready for school, and getting them into that compliance-based mode. And then we also have that other tension that societally we live in an ableist and neuronormative society. And I believe that parents, from conception to birth to early experience, are saturated by messages that in order to be a good parent, you have to produce a normal child. And so I feel like early educators are often really trying to balance that tension. And parents are diverse in and of themselves. So, lots of parents reject that messaging, but also lots of parents and carers are under the intensity and the pressure of that. So I think the starting point for me when I speak to early educators is asking, what was your motivation to care for and educate young children? And what you often find, I rarely meet an early educator that talks about creating normal children or wanting compliance or wanting children to be the same. They often talk about wanting to provide children with a sense of themselves, to belong to others and in community, to be able to advocate and have autonomy, to understand their different characteristics, why they're the same as other children and how they are different. And so for me, I think the starting point is really go to, at the core of why you are doing this, what is the reason? And I would say in the majority, you always have that percentage that maybe think a little bit wayward, but in the majority, we want children to have lived experiences that help them to thrive and flourish. And it's often the constraints around us that threaten that. But really go to the humanness of why do we do this? Why do we turn up and hang out with babies? Like, why are we there? And we're not there to get them to comply. We're there to help them to experience selfhood. So I suppose that's a bit of a weird answer, because there's no real tangible thing other than go back to what your motivation is. Because I think ableism, one of the biggest trickeries of it is it overrides instinct. And it makes us lose sight of why we're doing what we're doing. And I've made many errors in my own career. I've definitely engaged in ableist practice, because I thought, well, that's how we have to do it. We have to navigate the education system, or we have to comply or conform to what's expected. Otherwise, we're deemed to be failing children. And actually, I think that's a nonsense. So it's also being aware that ableism and neuronormativity trick us into thinking that we need to normalize children rather than help them to expand. I always see inclusion, inclusion almost seems like bringing everybody in, whereas I believe it is like expanding out. We're trying to get bigger and bigger and bigger the more that we understand about human development and child development. So yeah, does that answer, or is that, I do go off on tangents, I do apologise.
No, it absolutely did. But also it created, like, as you just said there at the end, about sometimes we think inclusion is get everyone in the room. But what you're saying is let's look at the room and see how can we expand it out to make it accessible to everyone that would like to be in the room or that maybe would like to be part of as you call it, the community. I suppose when I'm thinking again about your book, you talk a lot about neuro myths. Are there myths that say you come across all of the time, neuro myths, when you're supporting early years educators in their training and understanding, say ones that maybe come up most commonly that you want to maybe break a few down on the call today?
Well, yeah, the big ones for me is that, and again, I've been guilty of this myself early on in my career, but one of the biggest neuro myths for me is that if a child is neurodivergent identified or identifying, that play won't come naturally to that child. The reason I use that statement is I worked in a local authority for several years, and I was a SEND specialist, and I come to understand that a SEND specialist, or the way that I adopted that role, is that I understood how the SEND system worked. I understood procedure, but I actually had no clue about diverse child development. So if I went into an early childhood setting and I saw a child who happened to be, say, autistic or had Down syndrome or had developmental language differences, when I would go into that setting, if I couldn't immediately make sense of that play, if that play went outside of the parameters of normal or typical, if that play was repetitive, or if that play was big-bodied and boisterous and not calm, and you know, we have this big thing around playing nicely, I would say play doesn't come naturally to this child. We need to teach this child how to play functionally and properly and purposefully. And let's put some interventions in place to get this child to act, essentially, putting it crudely, more normal. And it was actually educators that would often really give me that rebuttal of, are you joking? This child is happy as Larry. They're having a ball. They're loving what they're doing. Look at the engagement and involvement of this child. And you're telling me that play doesn't come naturally. And it made me realise that as early educators, because we're under so much pressure to link play to learning and development, usually neuronormative descriptors of learning and development, to milestones, getting them school ready, anything that falls outside of those adult constructed definitions, we tend to reject. We also have this notion of play-based intervention and using these programs to then correct play. And it was only when I sat in the discomfort of not understanding play that my actual understanding of play developed massively. So one of the huge neuromyths for me is that the idea that a human doesn't know how to play. All humans have an innate capacity for playing, and we play in lots of different ways. We absolutely can experience stuck states, or we might have lived experiences that limit our access to the ways in which we want to play. But the idea that a child cannot play, I feel, is one of the biggest myths. And I think it leads to the othering of our neurodivergent and disabled children. And what evolutionary psychologists talk a lot about when they are exploring play is that it's through play that we produce new understandings of social behavior. And so in my mind, if we continue to deny, reject, and dismiss neurodivergent and disabled play, we're actually limiting our access to new knowledge about human development. And so over the last several years, with the diverse pathways as well, that's been a real opportunity for me to go outside of my comfort zone and to be like, I don't need to understand this play. I can sit in the unknowing space and actually let it unfold over time, rather than immediately trying to categorize it, or thinking that play needs to move through specific and neat sequential stages. Play is way more chaotic than that, and that is the joy of play. It's ambiguous, it is weird and wonderful, and I feel like it's really helped me to connect with children on a much deeper and humanizing level, really. So yeah, that's the big one for me.
And that actually brings me, as you were just saying about play, I was thinking about your incredible program, Play Patterns. Do you want to talk a little bit about that for, say, early years educators that maybe, for whatever reason, have unintentionally viewed play or autistic or neurodivergent play as maybe not correct play, and how maybe the play patterns Also just to recommend to everyone, you have an incredible website. I was printing this morning, all of the fabulous resources. So on your website, you provide, there's training available, there's resources, there's PDF files available. There's so much information available on your website. Do you want to just chat maybe a little bit about that and maybe segue in then to play patterns? Because I think that's really, really relevant to what you've just chatted about.
Yeah, so basically when I started my doctorate, I came across this article by Professor Carmel Con, and they have written a number of really amazing articles, and also Professor Dan Goodley and I think it's Catherine Runswick Cole. They've written something about the emancipation of disabled play, and I picked these up and read them. And you know that moment when your entire belief system is completely fractured and broken down into something else so you can build anew? So I read these things and I was like, I felt prickles on my skin, because I was like, oh my gosh, I've never picked up research before about disabled and neurodivergent children's play that writes about it in a way of affirmation, of recognition, of listening to lived experience. And so Professor Con's particular paper was looking essentially at the biographies of autistic adults, thinking back to the way that they played as children. And, you know, just reading this article, these biographies of how we played, and it made me really connect with my own autistic play patterns. And Con had used this term, play pattern, to signify that actually as humans, we don't all play the same. We have our own unique and often shared patterns as well. There's lots of intersection and crossover. But she talked about this idea that you almost like build up your own set of play patterns, and there can be themes associated to different ways of being. And there's loads of overlap, but she identified several themes where autistic adults talked about things that they were most drawn to. And it just really set me off on a bit of an adventure, really. So I ended up putting a call out to anyone who was listening, really. And I said, you know, I really think we need to start exploring diverse pathways of development. We need to stop being given child development guidance or descriptions of the way children play and develop that only centres typically developing and non-disabled children. And so many people came back to me and were like, yes, we're so sick of boring child development guidance that says 1, 2, 3, 4, this is the milestones, this is how all children play, these are the stages, these are the ages, these are the categories. And it's not that we're dismissing that there is a typical developmental trajectory, but how come when a child has a differentiated developmental pathway or a diverse one, why do we then look at that through a deficit lens? Why do we then pathologize those children? Why do we see those experiences as symptomatic rather than trait-based? And so I'd put a call out and I said, who wants to produce some child development guidance? But let's start with play, because we know something that comes naturally to all humans is an innate desire to play. And let's look at an area that we're particularly interested in, which is autistic play. I chose that because as an autistic adult, it really resonated. And I do believe that it's okay to really deep dive into particular areas. And so we got together as a group and we basically just looked at all the research out there about play. We drew upon lived experiences. We drew upon our own experiences of caring for and educating young children. And what we produced is 5 general themes of play with 18 distinct patterns. And what we are not saying in this document is that all autistic children or only autistic children. What we're trying to say is these patterns of play are often more salient or maybe more obvious in an autistic child. And whereas you might have historically been told that this is a wrong way to play, we're trying to increase your understanding that this is a valid way to play. And if you can see signs of involvement and engagement in this child, if they are happy as Larry and they are having a ball, why on earth would we intervene in that moment and correct them to try and get them onto a normal pathway? And I was terrified, absolutely terrified about putting it out there, because I didn't want people to think that I was suggesting that that this only belong to autistic children. I've met lots of people that says, oh, I've got an ADHD that also demonstrates that play pattern, or a typically developing child, but it's around that salience. And so that's kind of snowballed, where we're now producing other child development tools. So we're looking at communication identities, we're looking at energy and regulation rhythms. We've produced loads of resources on the website to make this information accessible. And essentially what we're trying to say is, we've been taught as early years educators that there is this universal developmental pathway that all children are travelling down. That is nonsense. We know that there are multiple childhoods, there are multiple developmental pathways, and we are entitled to have information about that so that we can do our jobs better. Because I am so tired of going into early childhood settings, and when there is an autistic child say, well, what do? We've got no idea how to support this child other than to use an intervention that tries to make them less autistic. And early educators are tired of it. They're sick of it, because it's like, just actually tell us, what is an autistic developmental pathway, or what might it look like, so I can meet that child where they're at. And so in the patterns, we cover autistic-led theory, we look at monotropism, we look at the double empathy problem, we look at the differences in interoception, we look at sensory highs, glimmers and glows. We explore Gestalt cognition. So we're trying to bring to the early years sector information that seems to be taken from them for government agendas about normalization. So yeah, sorry, I've really info spilled, but that's kind of where we're at.
I would say you've inspired myself and anyone that will be listening to our incredible podcast together. They will absolutely be inspired. I was thinking about a lot of what you said there, and about how we can try and be neuroaffirming, and how we need to move away from this idea of what is play, what is normal development, what is symptomatic, and move towards what is a trait, or what are we seeing. And it also made me think about, you have a section in the book talking about restful environments. So do you think there's a role here for early year educators to consider the environmental impact of the setting as well, and how we can look not only at the scheduling and not only at the layout, but looking at what is really neuroaffirmative and holistic for, and I would say any child, but in the context of the podcast, a neurodivergent child. What, I suppose, when you talk about that, for anyone listening, what do you mean, and how can they maybe be neuroaffirmative in their approach going forward?
Yeah, so in terms of the environment, I went to a conference last year, and I can't remember the name of the speakers, but they talked about this analogy of, like, when a child comes, or when anybody goes to any space, you've got to imagine that the space is like a swimming pool. And for a lot of children, if they feel safe in that space, and even though, a pool presents risks, there are things that might be uncertain, it requires particular skill sets and particular behaviours. But for most children, if they feel safe, they're going to jump into that pool. But for children, and usually those who are most marginalised, because they don't feel safe, actually when they're in that environment, they're going to feel pushed in. And why that really resonated with me is, I often say to early educators, children don't choose to necessarily be here. They didn't come to your setting and make the choice to go, that's the nursery for me. They rely on a parent or carer to make that decision. And so a lot of those decisions are out of their control, meaning that all children can find themselves in environments that might feel incompatible. And what I was noticing when I was going out to early childhood settings and in my own practice is that we have some fascinations or some pressures to either be really getting children school ready, and so that then translates into a very capitalist mindset that children constantly have to be productive, everything has to be linked to learning. And so even play, one of the concepts, and it's very controversial, and I know it makes people feel uncomfortable, but I really do not like the policy discourse around learning through play, because I think what's happened is, if you can't immediately say, here is some play and here is where it links to neuronormative developmental statements, we can disregard like pointless play or restful play. And so when I go into settings, what I'm trying to help educators to understand is that if you are neurodivergent identified or you're disabled and you're in an environment that is very much geared towards neuronormativity, you are going to be much more tired, much more easily overwhelmed. You're going to be more cranky because you're trying to navigate in an environment that is just not necessarily compatible with your nervous system or ways of being. And I think I was hearing so much around, well, we need calm down spaces and children just need to be calm all the time. And I was like, but actually, we also know that energy and self-regulation exists on this very broad spectrum. And, this idea that children just need to be calm is just not really a reality because we self-regulate in lots of different ways. So actually, I'm quite hyped up when I'm self-regulating. And so when I'm out in settings, I try to get them to think about, if we know that neuronormative spaces, which are rooted in productivity, capitalist agendas, neoliberalism, school readiness, we need to really use rest as resistance. And so I draw upon the work of Tricia Hearsay, and she talks about the importance of prioritizing rest within your environments that you exist. And so I'd also read, I always forget names, I do apologize, but the 7 types of rest, there's a TED talk, and I've extended it to the 10 types of rest. But basically, when I'm out in early childhood settings, rather than having a calm down corner, which can sometimes feel like, oh, this child's a bother, send them over to a corner and they can go and self-regulate by just being calm, which might lead to repression of emotions. It might lead to form responses. Actually, let's think about, do humans, which yes, we do, need different types of rest? And actually, that's very dynamic and contextual. So I speak to educators about sensory rest, mental rest, social rest, spiritual rest, active physical rest, embodied rest, playful rest. And what I'm trying to get educators to think about is, if we live in a world that is constantly telling us we need to be productive, we know we live in a world very much saturated by grind culture. Let's not be trading our children into that type of world. Let's let them know you are entitled to rest. I also really pick up with neurodivergent individuals, particularly, that they often talk about that they might not rest in conventional ways as well. And, as an ADHD, the thought of just being mindful or lying down, my brain is all up here. So actually, rest for me looks very different to the conventional style. And so in the environment, it's like, yes, set up play experiences and learning experiences, but always balance that with restful experiences. And actually, I put up a resource on diverse pathways yesterday, which is like a poster series of the different types of rest with some resources. And we also have a mini curriculum for it that you can download at Diverse Pathways. And again, not to say we don't also need calm, that also has a place, but it's one aspect of self-regulation and collective regulation. It's not the whole story. So yeah.
God, that was so interesting. And then as you're talking about the new resources, I was like, I'll be printing again directly after the call. What you said there about that rest looks different for different people. Like, I'm ADHD as well. I can't imagine. I can give you, it just reminded me of something that happened a few years ago. A friend of mine gave me it's like a spa treat or whatever it's called, for like a massage or whatever it was. And I've never been to a spa because that sounds to me like, and again, lovely, thoughtful gift, but hell. So anyway, the lady was trying to like give me a massage, and she was like, you don't need to keep talking. She was, people usually relax. But I was so dysregulated. I was like, so anyway, I'd say she was more dysregulated by the time I left, but it was like the least restful experience. Yet my friend was in another part of the spa that was just so amazing. And I was so like, I need to get out of here immediately. So I totally can relate to that, just as an adult, being like, what one person thinks is so regulating is not regulating for me whatsoever, and in fact has the opposite effect. So that I can totally relate to that. You referenced earlier about communication. I was downloading this earlier because I just think it's absolutely amazing. You collaborated with Ruth Jones SLT on the triangle of early attunement. Do you want to chat a little bit about that, or how that came about and how that might be useful for early years educators, if that's okay?
Yeah, so one of the things that we were really keen for in diverse pathways is that, for so long the government has banged on about partnership working, but not really presented any real and meaningful opportunities for us to develop solidarity across services. And so when diverse pathways came together, I was like, we need to almost like knock down this professional hierarchy. So to speak really candidly, as an early educator and spending a lot of time with other early educators, we know we're looked down upon in the education system. We know we are viewed as glorified babysitters. We know that there is this perception that because our qualifications don't meet certain professional thresholds, that we don't have knowledge. And we are a marginalised field, and I was speaking to lots of early educators that do have fear around, if I'm with an educational psychologist or if I'm with a speech and language therapist, I feel that I am less than, that my knowledge doesn't count, even though they have such intricate knowledge of their children and child development. And so one of the things that we really wanted to break down is these professional hierarchies, to be like, actually, early educators are specialists within our own right, and we do possess knowledge that will be different from, say, a speech and language therapist or an occupational therapist, but our knowledge is no less. And so if we can show those ways of collaborating, and Ruth is one of those people that there is no elitism in her approach. So we were like, actually, let's show how early educators can work with different specialists. And one of the things that me and Ruth have spoke a lot about is, and I've written about it in the book, is I absolutely hate the term early intervention. I find it clinical. I find it intimidating. I feel that it is not very apt when we're thinking about children with developmental differences and disabilities. So while I more broadly believe in early intervention, if there is a risk to the child, we absolutely should intervene. But suggesting that being neurodivergent or disabled in and of itself is an inherent risk, for me, is inherently ableist. So what I've noticed when I was going out to early childhood settings is I was like, these people aren't intervening in children's lives. They're not it kind of makes you feel like as though you're interfering or you're interrupting or you're disrupting a child's experiences. What I was observing in practice is I could really see early educators with their knowledge of the child tuning in, figuring out what was going on for that child and wanting to put something in place that really matched that child's experiences. So really doing stuff that was developmentally meaningful rather than developmentally appropriate. So really thinking about that meaningful moment. And so I just started to say to people, this is early intervention, this is early attunement. And actually, do we need a different framework when we're thinking about what it is that we're actually doing when we are interacting with our children? Similarly, parents and carers would come to me and be like, is that social care? Like, they'd immediately think that there is a judgment on their parenting capacity. And I was like, why are we terrifying people with this horrible word? And so early attunement really is just that. It's about, you see a child, you're trying to make sense of what's happening for that child, and what you're doing is you're engaging in the process of tuning in so you can then develop something that is developmentally meaningful, that has developmental benefits, that has affirming outcomes for that child, and that improves their quality of life. So I really try to get early educators to think about, no matter what you're planning for that child, always keep in your mind that what you are ultimately trying to do is improve their quality of life. And if you choose something that isn't improving their quality of life, i.e. taking them off for a random intervention in a separate room where they kick and scream when they have to go, that's not improving their quality of life. You're doing it to tick a box. And I think it's given permission to early educators to be like, no, this doesn't feel right and I'm not doing it. I'm going to do something that is rooted in early attunement, not early intervention, correction, and normalization. And so I think it's really, in the work that I've done with settings, it's really empowered them, I think.
That kind of brings back to what you said at the very start. Why did you go into the early years? Why are you here? What was your goal? And it was to attune with children, to support them, to have the best possible experiences in the early years, but to help them thrive and flourish and be exactly who they are, which are incredible little human beings that will one day be thought leaders, just like your incredible self here on the podcast. I suppose that brings me then, towards the end of the podcast, but also just to ask you maybe one or two of the questions that came in from all of the incredible listeners, one of which was from an early years educator that wanted to know what is the most neuroaffirmative way if you believe there's a child in the setting that is potentially, in this context they said autistic, that is potentially autistic. The parent may not be open right now to the idea that the child could be autistic, and we don't know the backstory as to the why or any of that kind of information. Not that they adore their child, absolutely, but for a variety, it could be just inherent ableism they've grown up with, we don't know. But what is the most appropriate approach to talk to a parent to let them know that you believe that the child could be autistic, and not using like the language of red flags and concerns? I know, yeah, even as I said, I'm like, oh God. So what's the most appropriate way to let the parent know that the child you believe is autistic, and then what's the next step? What should they be doing, or what should they be thinking about doing?
So it's a bit of a challenging one. So I don't know how it is in Ireland, but in England, one of the I think it's an unspoken recognition that we as early educators are not technically allowed to say to a parent, we think your child's autistic. We're not, because we're not qualified to make those judgments. However, I have had parents come to me before and be like, I think my child's autistic, and I've been like, I also think that. So you judge it on the relationship that you have. Dependent where the parent is in their own processing of their child's developmental experiences, it really is case by case. But generally, what I tend to do is, if I think that there is a little bit of a reluctance, I'm aware of the ableism that we all carry, and I don't want to disengage that parent by being like, I think you need to take your child for a referral, because actually that might lead to further disengagement. So the first thing for me is building trust in the relationship is a priority. What you've got to recognize is that parents are being exposed to messaging all the time in the media that there is a send crisis, that parents are in battle and fighting that send system. There is judgment towards parents of disabled and neurodivergent children and the children themselves. We only get told of one developmental trajectory in life, and we don't actually create hopeful stories about a good quality of life when you are disabled and neurodivergent. So I suppose what I'm saying there is, I fully understand a parent who may feel those anxieties because they are overwhelmed by media messaging about what it is to be neurodivergent and disabled. So for me, if I was working with a parent, my focus would not be necessarily on labeling. It would be on, I need you to know that I am in solidarity with you. I am not someone you're going to be battling. I am somebody that's standing by your side. And that might happen through, very small incremental moments over time. I've worked with families before where I've known they're definitely on a divergent developmental pathway, and it's been 2 years of building the relationship. And I would rather build that relationship and the diagnosis to come a bit later, so that we can actually then engage in meaningful support in that interim period. So the thing that I do in a different way is, rather than ever using the specific label, I will talk about the traits. So, for example, I might use the language of, I've noticed that your child has got a ruling passion. So I might not just say an interest, I will say they've got a ruling passion for trains, or they're really interested in, I had a child a while ago that really loved naming the bones in the body, like they knew every single bone in your body. And so I was like, that's a real ruling passion. Every day they come in and they want to recite the names of the bones, they want to look at the book about the human body. And so I'll start using the language gradually, so that that parent or carer is hearing affirming descriptions of something that might then go on to be associated with what we know currently is a medical diagnosis. And I think if you build that trust over time, and then you're putting support in. So again, for some parents, I might not refer to it as send support. because I think that there's massive issues with SEND support, but I might talk about adapting some practice, or I will use terms like differentiation, even though the government rejects it, because that is in truth what I'm doing. I can see that you have a developmental difference, and I'm going to differentiate and adapt to make sure you can access. And then in conversations, I will really empower the parent to share their perceptions. So almost like organically over time, that actually that might then come from them rather than from me. And so, yeah, I think everything's rooted in relationships. Everything is rooted in solidarity. And I do genuinely believe that the an unhurried approach is sometimes the best approach. And also, we can race for diagnosis, and then what happens is the parent thinks that that diagnosis is going to lead to suddenly all this support, and then they have that dull thud of, oh, there is no support. So actually, we sometimes situate diagnosis as like the gateway to, full understanding, but actually in early childhood, I think there is other experiences that can be just as valuable. But I know other people might think very differently to me on that one.
No, I'd be, I suppose, as a parent to 4 neurodivergent children, I think that approach is really important. It's creating felt safety, it's creating solidarity. And by the time, if it is, a point in time where the child may be identified as neurodivergent, the parents' background knowledge on neurodivergence is already immediately positive, which is what we want, because we want them to be able to view their child as the incredible human being that they are, and not be influenced by all the negativity, the stereotype, the ableism that's unfortunately online, in print, everywhere. People like yourself, thought leaders, are trying to change that narrative and give families and children in particular the best first step forward into understanding, maybe, as you say, their new diverse pathway into neurodivergence in their lives.
Just very briefly, just to also say, I think it also gives us an opportunity that where there are difficulties or challenges or even delays, because those things are apparent as well, that the parent has an opportunity to hear those things in a non-pathologizing way. I think that's where we need to do better in the neurodiversity movement, is that we're not denying impairment, difficulty and challenge. That is a reality of being a human, but we describe those things in a non-pathologizing way that does not then further stigmatize the child. And I think parents deserve to hear those things as early as possible, so that they then feel a level of self-efficacy to be able to support those areas as well. So it's that holistic element.
Yeah, but that makes total sense, because that means then we're not denying that people, like one of my boys is non-speaking, has significant support needs. Like, it's important for me to know what his needs are, but also acknowledge that that doesn't make him any less of the incredible human being that he is, because he's phenomenal and he's different to his brothers and his sister. But that's amazing, because I would love all of my children to be the individuals that they are, and that's what I try to do, I suppose, as a parent. But listen, thank you so much for all of the incredible information you have shared today. In the description part of this podcast, I'll have links to your social, to your website, to all of your phenomenal resources that I have been printing aplenty to your, and you have actually an array of books, so I'll put links everywhere that I can in the description, just so people can find out more about yourself. So listen, a huge thanks to Kerry. Thanks for sharing your incredible knowledge on the early years, and more than anything, just for continuing to inspire us all. As you say, from the cradle to the grave, this resource in particular, it's one for everyone, whether you're a parent, whether you're an early years educator, whether you're in primary, secondary, whatever stage of life you are at in raising your incredible children or working with children professionally. This is definitely, as you'll probably see by the background, if you're watching the video format of this podcast, I'm definitely a book recommender, and this is definitely one that needs to be on all shelves. So huge thanks to yourself, Kerry.
Thank you so much. That's so lovely. Thank you for inviting me on. Bye.
Bye.